One winter dusk, blood spread across a cabin door. A stranger collapsed, clutching a medallion tied to a widow's past. Then, the storm. A violent knock. Men pretending to be the law broke in. A silent cowboy rose to shield her and her boy. Through the snow, the wild Mustang ash charged, breath like smoke, eyes burning like fire. The truth emerged, the guilty exposed, and when dawn came, silence was no longer fear, but courage and love. This is more than a story of a cabin in the storm. It is where silence finally spoke, where hope returned. The story you are about to hear is not only about a cabin hidden deep in the Colorado woods. It is about silence, how it can weigh heavier than words, how it can break a family, and how, one night, silence itself would rise to speak. What happened on that winter dusk changed a widow, a child, and a man who carried secrets too heavy for his throat. If you want to follow this journey, leave a thought in the comments, share where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the silence inside this cabin is waiting to tell you more. Snow fell in silver sheets over the ridges of the Rocky Mountains. Pines bowed low under the burden of white, their needles whispering in the wind like prayers carried away into the dark. The sun had sunk, leaving behind a bruised horizon of violet and fading gold. Deep in the timberline, a single cabin crouched against the storm. Its chimney puffed out thin trails of smoke, a fragile sign of life in a world otherwise swallowed by cold. Beyond the tree line, a Mustang silhouette flickered, the ash-gray stallion, untamed, silent, watching from a distance as though the forest itself had sent a sentinel. The cabin was more than wood and nails. It was a fortress for memory, a place where laughter once lived, where loss had built its nest, and where each night was another trial of endurance. Every creak of its beams seemed to carry a story, waiting to be heard. Inside, Clara Monroe moved with the tired grace of a woman far older than her 27 years. She was tall and slim, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, strands escaping to brush her pale cheeks flushed by firelight. Her eyes, gray like storm clouds, held the weight of someone who had buried more than just a husband. They carried the burden of unfinished conversations, dreams broken in half. She wore a faded wool dress patched at the elbows, boots scuffed from years of work. Widowhood had etched restraint into her every movement, careful, economical, as if every gesture had to justify its cost. Beside her, Tommy, her 5-year-old boy, sprawled on a wool blanket near the hearth. His blonde hair was tousled, his cheeks rosy from heat and mischief. His eyes, blue and wide with innocence, followed every flicker of flame as though the fire was telling him stories only he could hear. He was small for his age, but full of restless energy, forever asking questions about the father he barely remembered and why the silence of winter felt so heavy. For Clara, Tommy was both anchor and storm, the reason she endured the isolation, and the mirror reflecting every fear she tried to hide. That evening, the silence outside cracked. At first, Clara thought it was the wind shaking loose a pine branch, but then 3 heavy thuds echoed against the wooden door. She froze, the ladle in her hand dripping stew back into the pot. No traveler came this far in winter. No neighbor braved the drifts at dusk. Tommy scrambled up, eyes bright. "Ma, someone's here." Clara's heart hammered. She reached for the rifle prop near the door, hands trembling though she had steadied it many times before at coyotes. She pulled Tommy back, pressed him behind her skirt. The latch groaned as she slid it open an inch, just enough to peer into the storm. There, slumped against the threshold, was a man. His coat was torn, his hat gone, snow crusted in his dark hair. Blood soaked through the fabric near his ribs, painting the whiteness beneath him in spreading crimson. His face was rugged, lined by hardship, but not yet old, perhaps 40. His lips moved, but no sound came, only the rasp of breath ripped by pain. And in his hand, clenched tight against death itself, was a small metal locket, scratched, but glinting faintly under the lantern's glow. Clara's chest tightened. She knew the design, the curved silver edges, the faint engraving of initials. She had touched that locket once before, years ago, when it belonged to her husband. But how? Her husband had died in a land dispute gone violent, buried without it. Her knees weakened, a storm outside and a storm rising within. Stranger or ghost, enemy or answer. Tommy peeked past her skirts and gasped. "Mama, is it Papa?" Clara's hand shook on the rifle. Every instinct screamed to bar the door, to protect her boy. And yet another voice whispered, a desperate plea she could not ignore. For a heartbeat, Clara glanced at the mantel above the hearth. A small wooden toy horse sat there, carved by her late husband's hand, its paint faded by Tommy's years of play. Beside it, their family photograph in a cracked frame. Clara younger, smiling, her husband tall and proud, Tommy still swaddled in her arms. Her eyes burned. Could she let her child believe salvation stood on the doorstep, only to slam the door? Could she deny the echo of a promise once whispered, that even in silence, love would find its way back? Her decision lingered on a knife's edge. The wind howled, the lantern flickered. Blood crept closer across the floorboards. Clara Monroe stood frozen, torn between fear and mercy, as dusk sealed the world in shadow. The stranger's eyes rolled back, his body sagged forward. The locket slipped from his fingers, clinking against the wooden floor. Clara bent instinctively to catch it, and in that instant realized the initials engraved upon it were not just familiar. They were her husband's. Her breath caught. She wanted to scream, but silence clamped her throat. Behind her, Tommy whispered, trembling, "Mama, let him in." And the cabin waited, holding its silence like a verdict yet to fall. The locket had struck the floor with a dull ring, and Clara's breath turned sharp as ice. She had seen the engraving, her husband's initials, carved deep into silver. Behind her, Tommy's whisper broke the silence like a prayer. "Mama, let him in." She had obeyed, by instinct, by mercy, by something she couldn't yet name. Dragging the stranger into her cabin, she shut the storm outside, though the wind clawed at the door as if furious at being denied its prey. His body sagged heavy against her arms, half-dead weight leaving streaks of blood across the wooden floor. She laid him down on the narrow cot by the fire, the glow painting his face in harsh strokes of shadow and flame. Clara stood back a moment, chest heaving, rifle still near her hand. The man's breathing was ragged, shallow, as though each breath fought to keep him tethered to life. His coat was torn to rags, one boot gone, and blood seeped endlessly from his side. His dark hair, damp with melted snow, clung to his temples. A scar carved a pale line down his cheek, leading to a jaw covered in rough stubble. He looked about 40, yet life had ground him into a figure much older, worn by storms harsher than the one outside. Clara forced herself forward. She could not let him die, not in front of her boy. Tearing strips of linen from an old sheet, she pressed them to the wound. Her hands moved with grim determination, though her heart recoiled at the closeness of this stranger who carried her husband's locket. The fire hissed, casting their shadows across the walls like restless spirits. His eyes fluttered open, dark as coal. For a moment, they searched her face, pleading, empty. His lips parted, and Clara braced herself for words. But what came was only a hoarse rasp, the breath of a man who had no voice. He tried again. Nothing. His throat strained, but silence answered. "You can't speak," Clara said softly, as though naming the truth would steady her. He blinked once, slow, a heavy acknowledgement. Then his gaze drifted to the ceiling beams, resignation etched across his face. Silence wasn't new to him. It was his companion. Tommy crept closer, the wooden horse clutched in his small hand. His voice quivered between fear and hope. "Mama, maybe it's Papa." He came back. Clara closed her eyes. The words tore at her more sharply than the storm. She wanted to correct him, to shield him. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came. Her gaze slipped unwillingly to the locket resting on the table. The cruel spark of silver mocked her. The stranger shifted weakly, his arm twitching against the blanket. His eyes roamed the cabin, sluggish but alert. Then he froze, his gaze locked upward to the mantel above the fire. Clara followed his line of sight. The photograph. It showed her as she had once been, smiling, hair neat, eyes bright with hope. Her husband stood tall beside her, proud, his hand on her shoulder. In her arms, Tommy swaddled, a baby, innocent to the grief that would shape him. The man's face collapsed into horror, his eyes widened, chest lurching as if struck. He tried to push himself upright, a strangled gasp clawing from his throat, but his body failed him. He reached a trembling hand toward the picture, fingers shaking, before falling back with a heavy groan. Sweat glistened on his skin, his whole frame shuddering with silent panic. Clara's blood chilled. "You know us," she whispered, the words breaking against her teeth. The man slammed his eyes shut, face twisting, as if denial could erase the truth. His silence screamed louder than any confession. Tommy, oblivious, curled near the fire, humming to himself, as sleep tugged his eyelids down. His small hand clutched the wooden horse tightly, a child's anchor against the unknown. The innocence in his breathing, steady and soft, was fragile glass in a room about to shatter. Clara sat rigid, the rifle close, her pulse hammering in her throat. She wanted to demand answers, but the man had no voice to give them. His silence pressed in around her, thick, suffocating. Every crack in the cabin walls seemed to echo questions. Who was he? Why the locket? Why that look at her family's face? The fire spat sparks into the air. The storm beat harder on the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like angry fists. Clara leaned forward, eyes on the stranger, her own silence trembling on the edge of breaking. Then it came, a sound, sharp, deliberate, cutting through wind and storm, a scrape, a shuffle, metal clinking faintly against wood. Clara froze. That was no tree branch, no storm-tossed debris. Someone was outside. Her heart lunged into her throat. She turned toward the door, blood roaring in her ears. The barn. Someone was at the barn. Her hand closed around the rifle, knuckles whitening. And on the cot, the stranger's eyes snapped open, dark and knowing, alive with fear that mirrored her own. The silence inside the cabin deepened, not empty, not still, waiting. The scrape outside had split the silence, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the rifle tighter, listening to the faint metallic clink near the barn. On the cot, the stranger's eyes opened wide, dark, alert, alive with a fear that mirrored her own. The storm swallowed everything beyond the cabin walls, but Clara knew what she had heard. Someone was out there. When morning came, gray and hollow, Clara stepped outside. The wind had calmed, leaving drifts piled high against the cabin walls. The snow crunched under her boots, brittle and sharp in the brittle air. She moved slowly, Tommy bundled against her side, the rifle across her back. That's when she saw them. Footprints, not hers, not Tommy's, not even the stranger's, who had not left his bed. A line of them, pressed deep into the snow, circling the cabin like wolves testing a fence. Clara's stomach tightened. Someone had been close enough to touch the walls. She followed the trail a few paces until it vanished into the trees. The forest loomed, pines heavy with snow, branches bending low as if shielding secrets. Beyond, a gray figure moved. Ash, the Mustang, stood at the edge of the woods. His ears flicked forward, his stance taut, watching. Clara met his gaze and felt a chill deeper than the cold. He had seen them too. Inside, the stranger sat propped against the cot, his face pale but eyes sharp. He motioned for paper and pencil from Clara's desk. His hand trembled as he scrawled uneven letters, the graphite breaking twice under his grip. He shoved the note toward her. "They're looking for me." Clara's breath faltered. She stared at the words. The jagged lines cut into the page like wounds. Tommy leaned close, peering at the scribble with wide eyes. "Who's looking for you?" Clara asked, voice low. The man only shook his head, jaw clenched. His silence was not weakness now, but defiance, as though speaking might invite death through the very door. Tommy climbed onto the cot, settling beside him without fear. "Mama says you can't talk," the boy said simply, "but you can write. So you're not really gone, are you?" For a moment, a flicker of something softened the stranger's face. He reached out, tentative, and ruffled Tommy's hair with a hand scarred and shaking. Clara turned away, her eyes drawn once more to the locket gleaming on the table. Its presence gnawed at her, a constant weight in the room. And then, as if a lock clicked inside her mind, a name surfaced. Jonas McGraw. Her breath hissed in. She remembered those endless nights of whispered arguments in town, the dispute over grazing lands, the bitter feud that had boiled into bloodshed. Her husband had died on that land, and Jonas McGraw's name had been there, tied to it all. She turned back to the man on her cot. His eyes met hers, and the horror in them told her he knew what she had remembered. Clara's hand went instinctively to the rifle. For a moment, she wanted to cast him back into the storm, to erase him from her home and her grief. But Tommy's small frame pressed against Jonas's side, unafraid, and Clara's rage was tangled in something else. Dread, confusion, an ache that would not settle. The cabin grew heavy with silence. Jonas reached for the paper again, but his hand faltered. Clara shoved it back to him, her voice tight. "Why my husband? Why your name tied to his grave?" Jonas scribbled, the pencil gouging the page. His breath came harsh, his jaw set. He shoved the paper into her palm. "I didn't kill him. I saw who did. They want me dead for knowing." The words cut deeper than a blade. Clara's chest heaved. If it were true, if he had carried this silence for years, then her husband's death was more than accident. It was murder buried beneath fear. Snow slipped from the roof with a heavy thud, shaking the cabin walls. Clara startled, the rifle rising to her shoulder. Night fell quickly that evening, the storm returning with a vengeance. The fire cracked low, shadows stretching across the walls. Clara sat rigid near the hearth, Tommy asleep in her lap, Jonas awake and watching every creak of the cabin as though expecting death to step through the door. Then it came, a knock, not timid, not polite, a pounding fist against wood, rattling the hinges. The sound boomed through the cabin, sharp, insistent, full of authority claimed but not earned. Once, twice, again. The storm roared outside, but inside, silence was louder still. The pounding on the door rattled the cabin walls, echoing like thunder inside Clara's chest. She froze, Tommy jerking awake in her lap, clutching his wooden horse. Jonas sat rigid on the cot, his dark eyes locked on the door, silent but knowing. The storm outside howled, yet this sound, this fist against wood, cut sharper than the wind. Clara forced herself to rise, rifle clenched in her hands. "Stay back," she whispered to Tommy, pushing him behind her. The knocking came again, louder, insistent, demanding. At last, a voice broke through the night, rough, commanding. "Open up! By law, we're here for the man inside. Jonas McGraw. He's wanted." Clara's blood chilled. Law. The word struck the air like a blade. She edged closer to the door, her knuckles whitening on the rifle. Jonas shook his head violently, lips parted as if he could scream, though no sound came. His hand slashed across his throat in warning. No. Clara cracked the door only an inch. Snow and wind blasted in, and through the gap she saw them. Two men, cloaked in thick coats, hats pulled low against the storm. Their shoulders were broad, eyes shadowed. One held up a badge that glinted under the lantern light. "Step aside, ma'am," the man barked. "We're here to take him." The badge gleamed, too bright, too clean. Clara narrowed her eyes. Her husband had once worked alongside the county sheriff. She knew the shape of a true badge. These were crude imitations, hammered metal meant to deceive. The edges were wrong, the star misaligned. Her heart thudded. They weren't lawmen at all. Before she could speak, Jonas staggered up from the cot. His body trembled, but his stance was sudden steel. He shoved Clara and Tommy behind him, one arm outstretched like a shield. His eyes blazed with silent defiance. The men at the door pushed harder. "Move, woman. Don't make us take you too." Clara raised her rifle. Her voice came steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. "You're no law I'll ever answer to." "This cabin is mine. You'll not cross it." The taller man sneered, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, twisted in a cruel smirk. "You think you can stop us?" He shoved against the door. Wood groaned, hinges straining. And then chaos erupted. Jonas lunged, with a force that seemed impossible for his battered body. He crashed against the door, slamming it back into the intruders. One stumbled into the snow, the other shoved forward, a knife flashing in his hand. Clara's rifle roared. The shot tore into the doorframe, splinters flying, the intruder ducking with a curse. Tommy screamed, "Mama!" The struggle surged inside. Snow burst across the floor as the taller man forced his way in, knife raised. Jonas met him head on, taking the blow against his shoulder instead of Clara's chest. The blade sliced deep, crimson blooming across his shirt. Still, Jonas drove the man back with sheer fury, his silence broken only by a guttural growl. The second man scrambled to his feet outside, hauling a pistol free. Clara swung the rifle toward him, heart hammering, but the gun misfired, a hollow click in the storm. Jonas roared soundlessly, shoving the knife-wielding man hard against the wall. The two grappled, shadows wrestling in the firelight. Clara grabbed the poker from the hearth, swinging it with both hands. It struck the intruder's skull with a sickening thud, sending him sprawling to the floor. The second man aimed through the doorway. Jonas lunged in front of Clara and Tommy, his body the barrier. The pistol cracked. The shot slammed into Jonas's side, spinning him down onto the blood-stained floor. Silence fell. Even the storm seemed to pause. Clara stood shaking, the poker still in her hands, the rifle at her feet. The intruder outside snarled, retreating into the night, dragging his unconscious companion with him. Their shadows disappeared into the blizzard, swallowed whole. Inside, Jonas lay gasping, his body trembling as blood seeped through his shirt. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing cloth to the wound, desperate. His eyes fluttered, dark and heavy with pain. His hand fumbled, finding hers, squeezing with what strength he had left. "Don't leave me," Clara whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. Tommy clung to her arm, sobbing. "Don't let them take him, Mama." Jonas's chest heaved once more, then sagged. He collapsed into unconsciousness, his silence deeper than ever. Clara knelt frozen, caught between terror and choice. If she kept him, danger would return. If she surrendered him, the boy's innocent faith, and perhaps the truth of her husband's death, would vanish with him. The fire flickered low, the storm raged, blood spread across the floor once more, and Clara understood. She had to decide. Jonas lay crumpled on the blood-slick floor, his body trembling in the aftermath of the fight. Clara pressed her hands hard against his wound, feeling his labored breath rise and fall beneath her palms. The fire spat sparks, shadows flickering over his gaunt face, his dark hair damp with sweat and storm water. Tommy crouched nearby, clutching his wooden horse, his small eyes wide with terror. The pounding on the door had stopped. The intruders had withdrawn into the storm, dragging their wounded with them. But Clara knew they would be back. The question gnawed at her. Would Jonas still be alive when they returned? She whispered his name, Jonas McGraw, testing it like a blade against her tongue. His eyelids fluttered, but he didn't answer. Then, with trembling fingers, he shoved something from his coat, a bundle of papers tied with string, stained by blood and smoke. He forced it into Clara's hands before coming once more. Clara untied the bundle. The papers unfolded like ghosts from another world, edges frayed, ink smudged by time. Under the lantern light, she saw names, signatures, sworn statements. One page bore testimony in jagged writing, accusing the wealthy rancher Caldwell of orchestrating the very land dispute that had ended her husband's life. Clara's chest tightened. The memory of that day surged back. She saw her husband's face again, strong and steady when he left the cabin years ago to confront Caldwell's men. She remembered the promise in his eyes that he would return before nightfall. Instead, men brought his body back at dawn, broken and bloodied, calling it an accident, a feud gone wrong. She had lived with doubt and silence ever since. Now the truth glared at her from the paper. Her hands trembled so hard she nearly dropped the bundle. "It was never an accident," she whispered. Jonas stirred, his hand reaching blindly across the floor. Clara gripped his fingers. His eyes cracked open, dark with pain, and he pointed to the papers. He gestured clumsily for her to turn one page. On the back, scratched in uneven script, were words simple yet devastating. "They killed him. I tried to tell. They silenced me." Clara felt the room tilt. Her knees nearly gave way. All these years, she had thought Jonas McGraw was an enemy, a name tied to betrayal. But here he was, the only man who had dared to hold the truth, paying for it with years of silence. "Mama?" Tommy's voice broke the air. "What does it say?" Clara blinked back tears. "It says the men who took your papa from us, they're still out there. And this man..." She looked at Jonas, whose lips trembled with unspoken words. "This man tried to stand against them." Tommy crawled closer, placing his small hand over Jonas's blood-stained one. "Then we can't let them take him, Mama." The storm roared outside, rattling the shutters. Clara rose, clutching the papers to her chest. She scanned each page quickly, her breath uneven. Names leapt at her. Caldwell's, his hired men, deputies on his payroll, promises of bribes, threats of violence, and Jonas's statement, buried beneath them all. She realized then why he had never spoken. His silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival. He had been hunted, forced to bury his voice. Yet he had carried this evidence all these years, waiting for a moment like this. Her gaze shifted to the window. Through the glass, Ash stood at the tree line, his gray coat dusted in snow, his breath steaming in the cold. His eyes met hers, steady, almost knowing. The Mustang had lingered for nights now, silent sentinel. Clara's heart quickened. If even the wild trusted Jonas, could she? Jonas stirred again. With immense effort, he pulled the pencil from the table and scrawled onto the back of another sheet. His hand shook violently, the graphite breaking twice, but he pressed on. Clara knelt beside him, guiding his wrist as though helping a child. Slowly words emerged. "Don't let it die with me." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. "It won't," she promised. "Not anymore." But even as she spoke, voices drifted on the wind. Men's voices, laughter muffled by the storm. Clara's stomach clenched. They were regrouping. She shoved the bundle of papers into a tin box, hiding it beneath the hearthstones. The fire crackled over them, masking their presence. She turned, meeting Jonas's dark eyes. He nodded weakly, his silent gratitude loud as thunder. Tommy clutched her skirts. "Mama, are they coming back?" Clara smoothed his hair, though her hand trembled. "Yes, but this time, we'll be ready." The door shuddered suddenly, as though tested by a boot. Clara snatched up her rifle, heart hammering. Jonas tried to rise again, his body shaking, but she pushed him gently back. "You've done enough," she said. Jonas's eyes flared, his hand clawing at her sleeve. He pointed at Tommy, then at the hidden tin. Clara understood. He would die before letting Caldwell's men take either. The storm seemed to hold its breath. Outside, Ash stamped the snow, tossing his head, ears pricked at the approach of unseen figures. The wind carried the crunch of boots, the murmur of orders. Clara's blood ran cold. The pounding returned, this time harder, more insistent. Clara leveled the rifle, her breath steady though her heart thundered. Tommy clutched Jonas's hand, refusing to let go. Jonas's chest heaved, his lips forming silent words. Clara didn't need to hear them. She knew what he was saying. Fight. The knock grew into a relentless hammering, echoing through the cabin like a war drum. And Clara understood. The truth had been revealed, but survival was not yet certain. The storm screamed, the fire flared, and the door shook on its hinges as if the night itself demanded entry. The pounding on the door had become relentless, each strike rattling the hinges, shaking the very timbers of the cabin. Clara stood rigid, rifle pressed against her shoulder, her breath shallow but steady. Beside her, Jonas leaned against the wall, one hand clutching his wound, the other gripping a broken chair leg like a weapon. His face was pale, but in his dark eyes burned a fire that refused to die. Tommy huddled near the hearth, clutching his wooden horse so tightly his knuckles whitened. His gaze darted between his mother and Jonas, fear mingling with a child's impossible hope. The storm outside shrieked as if echoing the fury within. Then, with a violent crash, the door burst inward. 3 men surged inside, their coats dusted with snow, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. Their eyes gleamed with greed and hatred. These were Caldwell's men, sent not for justice, but for silence. "Step aside, woman," one growled, brandishing a pistol. "The mute dies tonight." Clara raised the rifle, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "He speaks now," she answered coldly. "And you won't silence him?" The man sneered, stepping forward. Before he could fire, Jonas launched himself from the wall with a guttural growl that ripped from his throat, his silence breaking not in words, but in raw defiance. He collided with the intruder, knocking the pistol wide. A shot rang out, splintering the rafters above. Sparks of wood rained down. Chaos erupted. Clara fired, the recoil jolting her shoulder. One man dropped to the floor, clutching his leg. Another swung a knife, catching Clara's sleeve, but she struck back with the rifle butt, driving him into the wall. Tommy screamed, scrambling beneath the table. Outside, a shrill cry cut through the storm. Ash, the gray Mustang, reared against the cabin wall, hooves pounding, his wild cry like a trumpet of war. The intruders faltered, startled by the sudden presence of the beast. Snow cascaded from the roof as Ash struck again, shaking the walls. Jonas fought like a man reborn. Though blood soaked his shirt, his fists and fury were weapons enough. He pinned the pistol wielder to the ground, his jaw clenched, his throat straining, and then, miraculously, words tore free, jagged but clear. They killed her husband. The sound froze the cabin. Clara's heart leapt. Tommy gasped, his eyes shining. The men faltered, their bravado shaken by the voice they had sworn would never rise again. Clara seized the moment. You hear him? He carries the truth, Caldwell's truth. Her words rang like fire through the storm. The fight turned desperate. One intruder lunged toward Tommy, but Ash's head thrust through the shattered window, teeth bared, eyes blazing. The man stumbled back, terror flooding his face. Clara swung the rifle again, striking him down. The remaining men, bloodied and broken, stumbled into the storm, dragging their wounded with them. Silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with fear. It pulsed with life, with the echo of Jonas's reclaimed voice. Clara dropped to his side. His chest heaved, each breath a struggle. Blood seeped between her fingers as she pressed the cloth tighter. Stay with me, she whispered. Don't leave now. Not when you've spoken. Jonas's lips moved again, weaker but still audible. Tell them all. Don't let him win. Tears blurred Clara's vision. We'll tell them together. By dawn, the storm had eased. Pale light spilled over the valley, revealing the aftermath. Snow churned with footprints, blood staining the drifts, the cabin door hanging from broken hinges. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, carrying with it the scent of survival. Word had traveled quickly. Sheriff Danner arrived by midday, a tall man in a heavy coat, his face lined with years of weather and wear. His deputies followed, their eyes wary as they surveyed the battered cabin. Clara met him on the threshold, rifle still in her hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed but unflinching. You're late, she said quietly. The sheriff removed his hat, gaze heavy. Storm kept us back. But I see you weathered worse than snow. His eyes fell to Jonas, propped by the fire, pale but alive. Jonas tried to rise, but Clara steadied him. Don't, she murmured. You've done enough. The sheriff stepped inside, his boots crunching on broken glass. Is this true? Was it Caldwell's men? Clara nodded, then crossed to the hearth. She lifted the tin box from beneath the stones, its metal warm from the fire. With steady hands, she opened it and laid the papers on the table. Here is your proof, she said, her voice clear. Jonas carried it for years. My husband died because Caldwell wanted his land, and Jonas paid with silence. The sheriff skimmed the documents, his brow furrowing. Signatures, testimonies, details that could no longer be buried. He looked up, his face grim. This will hang Caldwell. You have my word. Jonas's voice cracked, rough but steady enough. Don't let him bury it again. The sheriff placed a hand on his shoulder. He won't. Not this time. As dusk fell, deputies led Caldwell's captured men through the snow, their heads bowed in defeat. The valley seemed to exhale, years of whispered fear lifting into the cold air. Inside, the fire burned brighter. Tommy sat at Jonas's side, clutching the wooden horse, his child voice carrying a new certainty. Mama, he's not silent anymore. Clara smiled through tears. No, darling. Silence has spoken. The following morning broke clear, the sky washed in gold. Clara stepped outside, the snow glittering like glass under the sun. Ash stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath curling in silver clouds. For a long moment, he watched her, ears pricked, eyes deep and knowing. Then, with a toss of his head, he turned toward the horizon. His hooves struck the snow in a steady rhythm, carrying him back to the wild. Clara's heart swelled. The Mustang had been their sentinel, their reminder that freedom could not be chained. Now he returned to the wilderness, leaving behind the proof of survival and the promise of hope. She turned back to the cabin. Jonas slept inside, his voice ragged but alive, his silence broken forever. Tommy laughed softly, chasing sparks from the fire. The cabin, once heavy with grief, now hummed with renewal. Clara stood tall, the winter sun warming her face. For the first time in years, she did not fear the silence. She embraced it, for it carried the echoes of truth, courage, and love. And as the valley lay quiet beneath the sky, Clara whispered to herself, "The silence has spoken, and it will never be silenced again." Sometimes silence carries heavier truths than words. In Clara's cabin, through fear, grief, and courage, a widow, a wounded man, and a child discovered that even the quietest voices can change everything. What we lose may shape us, but what we choose to protect, hope, truth, and one another, becomes the legacy we leave behind. It is a reminder that in the stillness of winter, love and courage can speak louder than any storm. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Share this story with someone you care about. And if it touched your heart, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Every story we share is a thread that binds us closer together.